The day they moved into the neighborhood had felt perfect. The sun was shining, birds were chirping, and the streets looked peaceful. The protagonist had spent months preparing for this move, packing boxes, arranging furniture, and making sure everything in the new house was just right. There was a sense of excitement in the air, the kind that comes from starting over, from having a place to call their own. They had imagined quiet mornings, friendly waves from neighbors, and evenings spent on the porch watching the sun go down. Life, at least at that moment, seemed simple and good. From the very beginning, everything seemed like it would be smooth. The neighbors were polite, waving from across the street, introducing themselves with smiles and small talk. There was one house a few doors down that seemed particularly lively, filled with flowers and a perfectly kept lawn. It looked like the kind of home where people took pride in their space, and the protagonist felt a little inspired. They had spent years living in apartments where privacy was rare and noise was constant. Here, there was space, a yard, and even a small garden to nurture. It felt like a dream, but soon a shadow appeared over the idyllic neighborhood. It started with small things, seemingly insignificant, but enough to plant a seed of unease. The neighbor in question, a woman who lived just next door, seemed to have a way of inserting herself into everything. She would watch from her window, always observing, always judging. The first hint of trouble came the day the protagonist parked their car slightly outside the marked line in the driveway. The neighbor appeared on her porch, frowning and shaking her head, muttering something about respect and rules. It was subtle, almost polite, but the undertone was sharp. The protagonist ignored it, thinking it was a one-time comment, perhaps just someone being overly particular. The next incident was more direct. A small note appeared on the windshield of the car, neatly folded with a message scrawled in hurried handwriting. It said the car had been parked improperly and needed to be moved. At first, the protagonist felt a flicker of irritation, but then amusement. Surely this couldn't become a pattern. However, over the next few days, the neighbor seemed to find more reasons to intervene. One evening, while trimming the hedges near the property line, the protagonist noticed her watching from her window again. She didn't wave, didn't smile. She simply stared, and the look in her eyes made it clear she was not pleased. It was unsettling, though the protagonist tried to brush it off. It was just nerves, they thought. Settling into a new place could be stressful. Things continued to escalate in small but meaningful ways. Mailboxes were monitored, deliveries scrutinized, and even the way the protagonist's kids played in the yard drew disapproving glances. The protagonist began noticing the neighbor walking around her property at odd times, sometimes stopping just to peer over at their yard. Friends who visited noticed it too, commenting on how unusual it was to have someone watch so closely. Yet the protagonist tried to maintain a friendly attitude, waving when possible, nodding politely, hoping that showing kindness would calm the situation. It became clear that the neighbor thrived on control. She had a presence that seemed to loom over the street, and she had rules for everything. Not rules in a general sense, like traffic or parking laws, but personal rules about how others should behave near her. The protagonist started to feel the weight of being watched, of every action being evaluated. Simple things like hanging laundry to dry or mowing the lawn became exercises in timing and discretion. Every movement seemed to carry the potential for criticism. One morning, the protagonist woke to find a complaint left under the door. It was about the sound of children playing. The note was written in firm, almost accusatory language, stating that the noise was disturbing and asking politely but firmly to keep it down. At first, it was confusing. The children had only been laughing and playing in the yard, nothing loud or excessive. But the note carried an energy, a tone of authority that made the protagonist pause. It was not just a request. It felt like a warning. The protagonist wondered if this was the way the neighbor operated, quietly exerting pressure until compliance became habitual. The tension started affecting daily life. The protagonist began checking outside constantly before stepping out, making sure no one was watching too closely. Simple joys like gardening or sitting on the porch began to feel like potential battles. The initial excitement of a fresh start was fading, replaced by a careful, calculated approach to even ordinary activities. Friends visiting the house noticed the subtle tension. the nervous glances at the windows, the hesitation to make a sound outside. The protagonist realized that this was more than just being particular. It was intimidation, subtle but persistent. The first confrontation happened at the mailbox. The protagonist had gone to check the mail and found the neighbor standing there, arms crossed, a disapproving look on her face. She started with polite words about community rules, but the undertone was clear. She was asserting dominance. The protagonist tried to remain calm, responding politely, but the encounter left a lingering unease. It was a turning point, marking the beginning of a constant battle for space. For freedom to live without constant scrutiny, over the next week's incidents grew more frequent. Cars were parked too close to the curb. Lawns were mowed at the wrong time. Decorations were set up for holidays. Everything seemed to attract attention. Each time, the neighbor found a reason to intervene, sometimes with notes, sometimes with comments shouted across the fence. The protagonist realized that ignoring the behavior was no longer an option. It wasn't just an annoyance. It was affecting peace of mind in everyday life. Family discussions began to center around how to handle the situation. Friends advised patience. Others suggested assertiveness. The protagonist weighed every option carefully, wanting to avoid conflict but also unwilling to surrender their space. Late at night, lying awake, they imagined ways to reclaim a sense of control without escalating matters. The desire was not revenge. It was safety and sanity, the ability to live without being constantly watched or judged. It was during this period that the protagonist started, observing the neighborhood more carefully, learning the patterns of the neighbor's behavior. She had routines, times when she was most active, moments when she seemed to seek out opportunities to assert authority. This observation became a tool, a way to plan actions that minimized confrontation and maximized control over the situation. The protagonist began keeping a subtle record, not out of malice, but for understanding. Noting when the intimidation appeared and in what form, despite the stress, there were moments of clarity and determination. The protagonist reminded themselves why they had moved here, the dreams that had fueled the decision to start fresh. They envisioned the yard, the garden, and the quiet streets as a sanctuary that needed protection. The idea of giving up never occurred. Instead, a strategy began to form. It was not about fighting fire with fire, but about smart, thoughtful actions to reclaim peace. Neighbors began to notice small changes. The protagonist became more intentional with movements around the property, or precise with tasks, always aware but never reactive. There was a calm confidence developing, quiet assurance that space and boundaries could be maintained without unnecessary confrontation. The neighborhood itself seemed to sense the shift. The protagonist's presence now is marked by careful observation and deliberate actions rather than fear. By the end of the first part of this story, the protagonist had made an important realization. Living under intimidation was not acceptable, and solutions had to be practical and lawful. The seed of an idea had been planted, one that would grow into a plan to reclaim control of their own home. The story had begun as a hopeful new chapter, then moved into tension and unease. But it was clear that determination and strategy were emerging. The protagonist understood that peace was not given. It had to be secured carefully, wisely, and without losing the integrity of the home and neighborhood. Life in the neighborhood was changing, the initial excitement tempered by the reality of human nature. The protagonist had learned a valuable lesson about observation, patience, and the necessity of boundaries. The next steps would require thought, planning, and courage, but the foundation had been laid. In these early days of living next to an overbearing neighbor, the protagonist had discovered not just the challenge of intimidation, but the inner strength to face it head-on. The first part of the story closed with a sense of resolve, the knowledge that the next chapter would demand creativity and boldness, but also fairness and careful action. This was not just a battle for control. It was a journey toward reclaiming home, peace, and personal space. One deliberate step at a time, days turned into weeks, and the tension with the neighbor did not ease. The protagonist found that the small incidents were now growing into more deliberate attempts at intimidation. It was not just the notes or the frowning glances anymore. The neighbor began showing up at unusual times, lingering near the driveway or peeking over fences. It felt less like casual observation and more like a display of control. Every time the protagonist stepped outside, there was a quiet fear of being watched or judged. They could sense the neighbor's eyes following, waiting for a misstep. And it made even ordinary tasks feel stressful. One afternoon, the protagonist decided to trim the bushes along the fence line. It was a task that usually brought satisfaction and peace, a way to care for the home and take pride in their property. But as soon as they started, the neighbor appeared on her porch, arms crossed, tapping her foot in impatience. She didn't speak at first, just watched intently, as if waiting for the protagonist to do something wrong. The protagonist felt the weight of her gaze and tried to focus on the task, but each movement seemed scrutinized. When they accidentally dropped a small branch onto the neighbor's lawn, she immediately called out, her voice sharp, accusing them of disrespecting her property. The protagonist apologized quickly, picked up the branch, and moved on. But the incident left a mark, a reminder that, simple, everyday actions were no longer private. The next confrontation came in the form of a complaint to the Homeowners Association. The neighbor had documented minor issues such as garden tools left out, noise levels during the day, and even the type of flowers planted. The protagonist received a formal letter stating that several complaints had been lodged, and they needed to correct these issues immediately. It was frustrating because none of these complaints were unreasonable in isolation, but together they painted a picture of someone under constant scrutiny. The protagonist felt cornered, as if no matter what they did, it was never enough. The sense of helplessness began to grow. But so did the determination to find a way to stand up. Visits from friends and family began to feel stressful as well. The protagonist noticed the neighbor watching from her window when people came to the house. Even casual greetings became tense, as though the neighbor expected perfection in every action. One evening, while a close friend was over for tea, the neighbor suddenly appeared at the edge of the property, her presence imposing and uncomfortable. She asked loudly if it was an approved gathering, glancing at the friend as though trying to embarrass both of them. The protagonist remained calm, smiling politely, trying not to escalate the situation, but inside there was a growing sense of frustration and the realization that ignoring the neighbor's behavior would no longer be enough. The protagonist started to notice patterns in the neighbor's behavior. She seemed to thrive on control and fear, enjoying the subtle stress she caused. The timing of her appearances was no accident. She would come out early in the morning when the protagonist was just starting the day or late in the evening when tasks were being wrapped up. Even weekends, which were meant for rest and enjoyment, were punctuated by her sudden presence. It became clear that the neighbor had made it her mission to unsettle anyone near her, to create tension without direct confrontation, but with consistent pressure. The protagonist tried reasoning with her, attempting calm conversations at moments when she seemed approachable. They explained their side, expressed willingness to cooperate on reasonable matters, and even tried humor to lighten tense moments. Yet each attempt seemed to backfire, turning even polite discussions into opportunities for further scrutiny. The neighbor would twist words, interpret them as excuses, and leave with a sense of triumph. It was disheartening, but the protagonist refused to give up. They realized that to live in peace, a more thoughtful, strategic approach was required. Late nights were spent planning and thinking, brainstorming solutions that were both effective and legal. The protagonist considered fences, locks, and security measures. Wanting to protect the home without creating conflict that could escalate further, each idea was weighed carefully. Safety, privacy, and compliance with local regulations became the guiding principles. The goal was clear: to reclaim the sense of ownership and freedom that had been slowly eroded by the neighbor's intimidation. It was a careful balance between asserting control and avoiding unnecessary escalation. Meanwhile, the emotional toll was growing. The protagonist felt drained by the constant vigilance, the need to plan every step outdoors, the worry that the neighbor might escalate even further. There were moments of doubt when the weight of the situation seemed overwhelming. Friends offered support, listening and encouraging them to remain calm and clever rather than reactive. The protagonist took comfort in these conversations, realizing that resilience was built not just through confrontation, but through careful thought and preparation. One particularly stressful day, the neighbor took a bolder step. She left a series of notes on the protagonist's doorstep, each pointing out alleged infractions. Some were petty, such as the placement of a garden gnome or the direction of a welcome mat. Others were slightly more aggressive, hinting at consequences if the rules were not followed. The tone was increasingly confrontational, designed to intimidate without directly threatening. The protagonist read the notes carefully, feeling a mix of frustration and determination. It was clear that ignoring the situation would only embolden her, so action was required. The protagonist began documenting each incident meticulously. Dates, times, descriptions, even photographs of minor interactions were recorded. This careful tracking was not just for personal clarity, but to prepare for any necessary steps involving the homeowners association or local authorities. Each entry served as a reminder of the need for structure and control, a way to turn the chaos imposed by the neighbor into manageable information. It was empowering, a way to reclaim some sense of agency in a situation designed to undermine it. In the midst of all this, life outside the conflict continued. The protagonist still tended to the garden, cooked meals, and hosted small gatherings with friends and family. These moments became precious, small reminders of normalcy, but the shadow of the neighbor loomed, influencing behavior in subtle ways. Tasks were completed with extra care, footsteps measured, voices moderated. Even the simple act of walking to the mailbox became a moment of tension, a quiet negotiation of space and presence. Despite the constant pressure, the protagonist began noticing small victories. There were moments when the neighbor's attempts at intimidation fell flat, when polite responses or deliberate calmness diffused potential confrontations. These small successes built confidence, reinforcing the idea that patience, observation, and careful planning were powerful tools. It became clear that the situation was not about giving in or fighting back aggressively, but about strategy, understanding patterns, and asserting boundaries in ways that were clear, firm, and undeniable. As the weeks went on, the protagonist's resolve strengthened. They had a growing awareness of what needed to be done to reclaim control of their home and protect their family. The intimidation was no longer just a source of stress. It had become a challenge, a problem that demanded clever, thoughtful solutions. The protagonist envisioned a plan, one that would not only secure the property, but also establish clear boundaries that could not be crossed. The goal was not revenge, but peace, a way to ensure that the home remained a sanctuary rather than a source of anxiety. By the end of this period, the protagonist had fully embraced the need for action. The subtle psychological pressure exerted by the neighbor had revealed an important truth. Living under constant scrutiny was unsustainable, and reclaiming control required initiative and intelligence. The stage was set for the next step, decisive move that would change the dynamic and establish authority in a way that was safe, legal, and lasting. The protagonist had learned valuable lessons about patience, observation, and strategic thinking, preparing for a solution that would finally bring peace to their home. The story had shifted from simple annoyance to careful planning, and the next chapter promised the start of a clever and deliberate response that would finally address the neighbor's persistent intimidation. After weeks of dealing with constant scrutiny and subtle intimidation, the protagonist realized that waiting and hoping the neighbor would change was no longer an option. It was time to take control of the situation and find a practical solution that would protect their home and give them peace of mind. The first step was careful observation and planning. They spent time noting the neighbor's routines, figuring out when she was most likely to appear, identifying moments when she was less active. This understanding became crucial in creating a strategy that was deliberate, calculated, and effective. The protagonist began researching solutions that were legal, safe, and would give them autonomy over their property. Fences, locks, gates, and other security measures became the focus. They spent hours online reading reviews, watching tutorials, and consulting with experts. Every option was considered carefully, with attention paid to the legal boundaries set by the Homeowners Association and local regulations, the goal was clear: install a solution that would secure the property without causing unnecessary conflict. A solution that would be respected by the neighbor, but impossible for her. To manipulate or bypass consultations with professionals were the next step. The protagonist spoke with builders, locksmiths, and security experts to understand what was feasible and most effective. Each expert offered insights about durability, functionality, and security. The protagonist learned about reinforced gates, electronic locks, and methods for ensuring privacy while maintaining aesthetic appeal. They took notes on costs, installation times, and maintenance requirements, carefully weighing each option. Every detail mattered, from the type of material to the mechanism that would control access. It was a process that required patience and attention to detail. But the protagonist was determined to get it right. While planning, the protagonist continued to manage day-to-day life. Each morning began with careful observation of the neighbor, assessing her presence and potential interference. Tasks like gardening or checking the mailbox were performed strategically to minimize confrontation. Even casual walks around the property were timed to avoid unnecessary encounters. Though these measures required patience, they also gave the protagonist a sense of control over their environment. It was a way to reclaim small victories and maintain composure amid ongoing pressure. As plans for a gate became more concrete, the protagonist also thought about how it would affect the overall flow of the property and the neighborhood. They wanted a solution that was not only functional, but also visually appropriate, blending with the home and the surroundings. This attention to detail reflected the protagonist's desire for balance, to assert control without creating an eyesore or a sense of aggression. Every element, from design to placement, was carefully considered to ensure both security and harmony. Meanwhile, the neighbor continued her pattern of subtle intimidation. She would walk near the property line at odd hours, peer through windows, and make casual but pointed comments when passing by. Her actions were deliberate, designed to unsettle and provoke a response. The protagonist responded with calmness and caution, refusing to react impulsively. Each encounter was noted, reinforcing the need for a solution that would firmly establish boundaries without resorting to direct confrontation. In preparation for the installation, the protagonist mapped out the exact placement of the gate. Considering access points, visibility, and security, they measured distances, accounted for slope and terrain, and visualized how the gate would operate daily. Decisions about materials were finalized. A sturdy metal frame with reinforced locking mechanisms that would withstand attempts to tamper with it. The electronic access control system was chosen to ensure that only the protagonist and authorized individuals could open it. This level of planning brought a sense of empowerment, a feeling that the protagonist was no longer at the mercy of the neighbor's unpredictable behavior. As the day of installation approached, excitement mixed with apprehension. The protagonist anticipated the moment when the gate would be operational, knowing that it would mark a turning point in their ability to manage the property. The installation team arrived early, and the work began with precision. Each component was carefully positioned and secured. The protagonist watched closely, ensuring that every detail matched their plan. It was a long day, with careful adjustments, alignment checks, and final touches to guarantee functionality and aesthetics. During the installation, the neighbor appeared unexpectedly. She observed from a distance, frowning and muttering to herself. The protagonist maintained composure, acknowledging her presence with a polite nod, but refusing to engage in conversation. It was a test of patience and restraint, reinforcing the importance of remaining calm and strategic. The neighbor's curiosity and frustration were evident, but the protagonist focused on the task at hand, determined to complete the installation without distraction or escalation. Once the gate was installed, the protagonist tested it thoroughly. They checked the electronic lock, ensured smooth operation, and verified that the gate could not be opened without proper authorization. Every possible scenario was considered: accidental opening, mechanical failure, and potential interference by the neighbor. The protagonist's careful planning paid off. The gate functioned perfectly, providing both security and peace of mind. It was more than a physical barrier. It was a statement of control and autonomy. The immediate effect was noticeable. The neighbor's attempts at intimidation became less frequent as the gate presented an insurmountable obstacle. The protagonist observed her from the porch, noting the frustration in her expressions and the shift in her behavior. She could no longer walk onto the property uninvited, peer over fences at will, or influence the protagonist's activities. The psychological impact was profound. The protagonist felt relief, empowerment, and a renewed sense of safety. The gate had become a tool of protection and a symbol of reclaiming personal space. In the days following the installation, the protagonist adjusted to the new dynamic. Daily routines became more relaxed, and simple activities no longer carried the weight of constant scrutiny. Gardening, walking, and social visits regained their sense of normalcy. Even the presence of the neighbor was less intimidating. As the physical boundary reinforced the protagonist's authority over their own property, the experience highlighted the importance of preparation, strategic thinking, and patience in dealing with persistent challenges. Friends and family visiting the house noticed the change immediately. Conversations were no longer punctuated by concern over the neighbor's reactions. Guests felt more at ease, enjoying the space and atmosphere of the home without the tension that had once dominated interactions. The protagonist felt pride in having handled the situation intelligently, relying on planning, observation, and thoughtful action rather than confrontation or aggression. It was a lesson in resilience and problem-solving, demonstrating that careful strategy could transform a stressful situation into one of empowerment. Throughout this process, the protagonist also reflected on the personal growth that had occurred. The experience of dealing with the neighbor's intimidation had strengthened patience, observational skills, and the ability to make measured decisions under pressure. It reinforced the value of maintaining composure and focusing on long-term solutions rather than immediate reactions. The protagonist realized that challenges, even unpleasant ones, could be opportunities for growth and learning, providing insight into human behavior and personal capabilities. By the end of this period, the protagonist had successfully implemented a solution that addressed both the practical and psychological aspects of the problem. The gate was more than a physical barrier. It was a tool of empowerment, providing security, autonomy, and peace of mind. The neighbor's influence had been diminished, and the protagonist had regained control of their home. The experience highlighted the importance of careful planning, strategic thinking, and resilience in the face of persistent challenges, setting the stage for further developments in maintaining personal boundaries and navigating complex interpersonal dynamics. The stage was now set for the next phase, where the impact of the protagonist's careful planning would become increasingly evident, and the balance of power would shift definitively in their favor. Once the gate was fully installed, the protagonist felt a mixture of relief, pride, and anticipation. It wasn't just about having a secure entrance. It was about reclaiming personal space and asserting boundaries. The days that followed were marked by a noticeable shift in the neighborhood dynamic. The neighbor, who had once seemed untouchable in her presence and control, now faced a barrier that she could not cross. The psychological impact was immediate. The protagonists no longer felt the weight of constant surveillance and could move about their property with a renewed sense of freedom. First real test came when the neighbor approached the gate for the first time. She had walked up as if she intended to intervene, to assert her authority once again, only to find herself stopped by a solid barrier. The protagonist, standing a few steps back, watched quietly. The neighbor tried the handle, rattled the gate, and even peered through the bars, hoping to find a weakness. Her frustration was palpable, and the protagonist felt a quiet satisfaction, not from revenge, but from knowing that the boundary they had established was working exactly as intended. This moment marked a turning point. The protagonist had taken control without confrontation, using intelligence and careful planning rather than aggression. Life around the house began to feel lighter. Simple routines like taking out the trash, walking to the mailbox, or letting the kids play in the yard no longer carried anxiety. There was a sense of normalcy returning, a feeling that the home was once again a sanctuary rather than a source of stress. The protagonist still remained vigilant, of course, but the constant fear of the neighbors' interference had diminished. The gate was a symbol of both security and independence, a tangible reminder that the protagonist had the power to protect their own space, even the neighbors. Attempts to intimidate became less frequent. She would linger near the fence or watch from a distance. But the inability to access the property changed the dynamic entirely. The protagonist observed her behavior, noting the subtle signs of frustration in her pacing, her muttered comments, and the way she avoided direct interaction. Each observation reinforced the effectiveness of the solution. The gate was more than a physical barrier. It was a psychological one, reducing the impact of intimidation without escalating conflict. The protagonist felt confident that the situation was now manageable. With control firmly back in their hands, the protagonist also began to consider the broader implications of the change. Friends and family visiting the home noticed the shift immediately. They commented on the newfound sense of ease and comfort, the ability to enjoy the yard and porch without constant worry. Social gatherings became more relaxed, and interactions with neighbors were less tense. The protagonist reflected on how much of daily life had previously been overshadowed by anxiety and careful calculation. Now the focus could shift back to enjoying the home, nurturing relationships, and pursuing hobbies without the looming pressure of unwanted oversight. During this period, the protagonist also focused on maintaining a balance between security and community relationships. While the gate was a firm boundary, it was also designed to be visually appealing, blending with the home's aesthetics and the neighborhood environment. This attention to detail helped ensure that the solution was respectful, reinforcing the idea that boundaries could be asserted without creating unnecessary conflict or appearing aggressive. The protagonist's approach was thoughtful, aiming for both effectiveness and harmony. Observing the neighbors' reactions over the following days offered valuable insights. She seemed to shift her tactics, sometimes attempting indirect methods of influence, such as subtle comments from her porch or watching from a distance. The protagonist remained calm, noting each behavior without overreacting. It was a reminder that control over one's environment required continuous awareness and strategic thinking. Every action was measured. The protagonist learned to anticipate potential issues without allowing them to dominate daily life. One afternoon, the protagonist decided to test the gate's effectiveness further. They observed the neighbor as she approached, pretending to be engaged in ordinary tasks like watering flowers or organizing outdoor furniture. The neighbor moved closer, seemingly expecting some opportunity to intervene, only to be stopped by the sturdy barrier. She tried minor tactics, such as shaking the gate or calling out. But the protagonist responded calmly, maintaining composure and focusing on their own tasks. This practical test reinforced the effectiveness of the solution and boosted the protagonist's confidence in their ability to manage the situation. The sense of empowerment extended beyond physical security. The protagonist realized that the experience had strengthened their resilience, patience, and problem-solving skills. Dealing with the neighbor's intimidation had required careful observation, planning, and strategic action. The gate was the tangible result of these efforts, but the intangible growth calmness under pressure, foresight, and assertiveness was equally valuable. The protagonist felt equipped to handle future challenges with clarity and confidence, understanding that preparation and intelligence were as important as physical solutions. As the neighborhood began to adjust to the new reality, the protagonist also reflected on the broader lessons of the experience. It was clear that boundaries and personal space were essential for well-being. The experience had highlighted the importance of maintaining composure, observing patterns, and taking deliberate action rather than reacting impulsively. The protagonist understood that peaceful solutions often required patience, planning, and a combination of physical and psychological measures to ensure effectiveness. Friends visiting the home remarked on the positive change. Conversations were more relaxed, laughter came more easily, and the protagonist could fully engage in activities without the shadow of intimidation. The gate had transformed not only the physical environment, but also the emotional atmosphere of the home. It was a constant reminder that challenges could be met with intelligence and thoughtful action, and that empowerment often came from preparation and strategic decisions rather than confrontation. Over time, the neighbor's influence diminished further. Her attempts to interfere or intimidate became rare, and when they did occur, they were met with calm confidence rather than stress or fear. The protagonist had established a clear message. The home was a private space. Boundaries were respected, and attempts to control or intimidate would not succeed. The psychological shift was profound. Reducing anxiety and creating a sense of stability and autonomy, daily routines returned to a sense of normalcy. Gardening, outdoor chores, and family activities proceeded without tension. The protagonist felt pride in the solution and in the personal growth that had come from navigating the challenge. The experience had been a test of patience, resilience, and strategic thinking, and the successful implementation of the gate validated all the careful planning and effort. It was a milestone, marking a new chapter in life where control, safety, and peace of mind were restored. The final realization in this phase of the story was clear. True empowerment came from thoughtful action, careful planning, and the courage to assert boundaries. The protagonist had transformed a stressful situation into an opportunity for growth, learning, and regained autonomy. The gate was more than metal and electronic locks. It was a symbol of control, independence, and the ability to live without fear. The neighbor's attempts to intimidate were neutralized, and the protagonist's confidence in managing personal space and boundaries had reached a new level. By the end of this period, the protagonist felt a deep sense of accomplishment and relief. The home had become a safe haven again, a place of comfort, stability, and privacy. The challenges faced had been significant, but the careful, strategic approach had yielded lasting results. The experience reinforced the value of observation, patience, planning, and calm decision-making. The stage was now set for the final part of the story, where the long-term effects of the gate and the protagonist's strategic approach would fully unfold, demonstrating the ultimate triumph over intimidation and the restoration of peace and control in their home. The days following the gate installation brought a sense of calm that the protagonist had not felt since moving in. The constant tension that had once overshadowed every action, every walk in the yard, every moment outside, had begun to dissipate. The neighbor, who had once seemed like an unstoppable force, was now largely powerless to interfere. The physical presence of the gate had created a boundary that could not be crossed without permission, and the psychological impact on both sides was profound. The protagonist felt a renewed sense of control over their life and their space. The first few weeks were marked by careful observation. The protagonist continued to monitor the neighbor, not out of malice, but to understand how her behavior changed. The neighbor appeared frustrated at first, pacing her porch and muttering under her breath, clearly unable to exert the same influence she once had. But over time, her appearances became less frequent. The protagonist noticed that she had begun to redirect her attention elsewhere, likely realizing that her intimidation tactics no longer had the desired effect. This shift allowed the protagonist to reclaim not just physical space, but emotional freedom as well. Family life began to flourish. The protagonist's children played freely in the yard without fear of scrutiny, laughter ringing out where once there had been tension. Friends and extended family visited without hesitation, enjoying meals, conversations, and the simple joy of spending time together. The gate had become more than a security measure. It was a symbol of peace, autonomy, and protection. The protagonist felt proud not only of the decision to install it, but of the careful, strategic thought that had gone into every aspect of the plan. Each small victory over intimidation reinforced the belief that challenges could be met with intelligence and patience rather than force. Social interactions in the neighborhood also began to shift. While some neighbors had been curious or supportive from the beginning, others who had previously been passive observers now took notice of the change. The protagonists carried themselves with calm confidence, engaging politely but firmly with anyone who approached. There was no aggression, no need for confrontation. The presence of the gate itself communicated boundaries and the way the protagonist managed the situation demonstrated self-assurance and composure. It became clear that control and respect were not about fear, but about consistent, deliberate actions. One afternoon, the neighbor approached the gate again, perhaps testing the limits one last time. She tried the handle, rattled the lock, and looked over the top as if searching for a weakness. The protagonist watched quietly from a distance, calm and collected. This time, there was no tension in the air, no hesitation or fear. The gate did its job perfectly, preventing access and establishing clear boundaries. The neighbor eventually walked away, muttering to herself, and the protagonist returned to their yard, feeling a sense of triumph, rooted not in hostility, but in wisdom, preparation, and strategic thinking.